Follow up on the Enlightenment discussion. Richie Robertson's book, The Enlightenment, that we discussed yesterday formally. The follow up is on the concept of freedom, antitrust, large companies, and scaling. And the argument is the following: there is an idea that large companies are good because of economies of scale. And I just want to turn this around and say economies of scale lead to large companies. So it's not like we want to have large companies and then reap economies of scale. I think there's a misconception in the economics profession. But if you look at the reality on the ground, it's actually the other way around. The only reason we have large companies, at least legally, is because large companies are in the exploitation business. They actually are in the scaling business. We've talked about this before in this podcast, and the concept of scaling is underappreciated. It's taken for granted, or it's kind of like one of those things where we say, well, we have this technology, we have this idea, and then, oh yeah, somebody scaled it up. And then, yeah, lo and behold, that person who scaled it up became the richest man in the world. And that's, I think, of course, political discussion and all of that. But fundamentally, what we're doing wrong here in the conversation is we're we're not appreciating the fact that the scaling itself is a technology. It's knowledge. It's know-how. It's something that, well, most people get compensated for. The reason people get compensated for scaling is because it's hard. And there's actually very little knowledge about it. I want to talk about this in particular also with the discussion of antitrust and how we as investors in Tesla, which is one of those companies that in our opinion will become a large company, I mean much larger than it is today because of scaling, because they are exactly in that business of scaling, and how we deal with that. This is not even on podcast. It's August 26, 2023. This is Krim Telco. It's a Saturday. There's no update. For the year, we are up 106.5%. The market's up 14.8%. We're outperforming by 91.7%. So we're talking about antitrust in the context of and the Enlightenment. So just to give the context for readers, please listen to our discussion of Richie Robertson's book, The Enlightenment, for more detail of this particular topic. But we're of the opinion here at Orange Capital Partners that we are, on the one hand, still living in the Enlightenment, that the Enlightenment is the goal of the Enlightenment is the pursuit of happiness of man. We achieve that through liberty. Liberty leads to wealth. Wealth leads to liberty. And the discussion here is, how do we do that without creating an autocracy? How do we prevent large powers from taking over? There is the concept, I always use the cheese example, right? It's good to have bacteria in the cheese. If there's too much, the cheese is not edible. We can kind of use that same analogy for autocracies in business. So if we take Tesla, for example, Tesla's in the business of scaling, right? As much R&D and technology that they do, their real skill, their real raison d'etre is the ability to scale technologies. If you look at the material science departments of universities, even just here in California, I'm sure globally it's even more extreme. You will see lots and lots and lots of technologies that are being developed in the lab that are better than Tesla's technology, that could enhance Tesla, that could enhance the competitors. But the problem is, of course, that those technologies are not being scaled. They're just in the lab. And as hard as it is to come up with a new material that is more heat resistant and less strenuous, less prone to breaking and stuff like that, it is very, very difficult to produce millions of cars with that type of material. And this is what Tesla, the business of Tesla. Another company that we're invested in, NVIDIA, actually is in the scaling business too. And Jensen Huang, actually, for the first time, at least that I know, on an earnings call, talked about manufacturing, about scaling, about the ability to manufacture at scale, of course, because NVIDIA is also in the business of scaling right now because there's so much demand for their technology. So we are, if you look at Amazon, even Facebook, which is a software-driven business, but even there, scaling is the key. Okay, how do you scale a social network from 1,000 users to 1 billion users? That's not so easy. And we go on and we go on. Of course, Google, if you take some of the big early days of Google's big early decisions that Google made, they are all also in the business of scaling. Let's say they bought a lot of commodity hardware to facilitate search, etc. So all of these things are about scaling. My concept, my point here in this episode is that we don't want to just talk about large companies and antitrust in the context of, well, we have large companies, let's say GM becomes large and then they have efficiencies and so on and so forth. It is the fact that they have efficiencies and that they scale that makes them large. And mergers and acquisitions are a different topic here that I don't want to discuss too much, because that is definitely part of an antitrust problem, and that is actually the only antitrust problem that the legal community is talking about, and rightly so. But what I want to talk about here is the other side of scale, of largeness in the economy, and that is when you scale through knowledge. When your raison d'être, when your ability to scale is actually your know-how. Like, David Deutsch says, knowledge is the ability to do a transformation. To, the universal constructor theory is, if we have a universal constructor, then all we need is knowledge to transform stuff, to make, long-lasting batteries out of lithium and nickel and so forth. All we need is a universal constructor. Right now, we call these universal constructors, we call them entrepreneurs, companies. We call it R&D. That kind of thing. And Deutsch's universal constructor is just sort of an abstract knowledge, acquisition vehicle that transforms material from one to another, which is what wealth is, according to David Deutsch. So let's get back on point. So the real skill of a company, at least as far as wealth creation is concerned, the real skill, the only skill that matters, is scaling. Let's let that sink in a little bit. The real skill, the skill of a company, the reason a company exists, or the reason companies exist, is scaling. This goes back to the theory of the firm. Even, Coase's famous article he wrote in the 30s, I believe. It's not about transaction costs, none of that stuff. It's part of it back then, but if we look today, transaction costs and so on and so forth, they're not the problem. The problem is scaling. How do we go from it's not 0 to 1. It's actually 1 to infinite. That's the problem. 0 to 1 is a problem too. And as much as I like Peter Thiel's book, it's part of our principle stack, it is the other side of the coin, the 1 to n, which is the real wealth creating part of things. There's so many, living in Silicon Valley, you learn that there are many, there's so many ideas, there's so many interesting approaches to problems and so on and so forth. There's all kinds of potential ideas. You have, Instacart is just filing for an IPO. You have Uber. You have, Dropbox. You have whatever. All these companies that came and keep coming out of the woodwork. And kudos for them. Even those that don't. So Yelp. Yelp's a $3 billion company. It's, they've created a living for hundreds of people, hundreds of employees. They made their founders rich. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But wealth creation from an investor's perspective, from us, investors, Orange Capital Partners, wealth creation really only matters when we talk about scaling. We're not in the business of 0 to 1. We're not in the business of, writing $50,000 checks on series or on seed rounds and then hoping that they go 10x and then get out and all that stuff. We don't do that kind of thing. It's what we do is we invest in large companies and then they become much, much larger. We are in the dollars business. We create dollars. So we go, what I mean with that is we might only, make a 10x only only just relative to the sort of VC community that makes 1,000 times X, right? We might be in the 10x business, but if you go from 100 billion to a trillion, you've just created 900 billion of market cap. That's the business we're after. And that is a scalable business also from our perspective. That means we can invest a lot of money without disturbing the market, but that's for a different conversation. I'm talking now about the thing with scaling is the following. What is the real skill of scaling is to take a technology and then build an infrastructure to produce it at scale, at quality. That's the problem. It's the quality. Elon Musk talks about quality all the time. Jensen Huang, not so much. Facebook, a little bit too. Amazon, not so much. Musk talks about quality all the time. We need micrometer precision. We need this, we need that. We need to scale. We need every other word in the Tesla community is scale. We need to scale the FSD data collection. We need to find a way to auto-label the data, which is another word for scaling. Scaling is continuously part of the equation here. Now, how does Tesla solve it? That's probably not even worth just an episode. That's worth a book. But I would say, in a nutshell, what Musk is doing intuitively is he's putting metrics on everything. What gets measured gets done. That's an old saying that I've learned on Wall Street, and I think it applies to everything in industry. What gets measured gets done. This is how you scale. Once you put a number on things, you can industrialize it, you can efficientalize it, and I'm sorry for the word that I just made up. My point is, if you can put a number on things, if you can put people accountable for delivering something against a goal which is computational, that it has to be computational. That's how you scale things. You want to do, you want to create X amount of precision for the Cybertruck. Well, we need a sub-micrometer, or whatever he said. So now every part you make, every process on that production line has that same goal, and it's also accountable. I always use my son plays soccer, and I've always talked to the coaches. Your problem is not strategy or all this other stuff, money, and we need better strikers. And no. Your problem is very simple. It's very simply measurable. There's 5 skills in soccer. You control the ball, you pass the ball, you control with the chest, you header, and you juggle. These are all quantifiable, measurable skills. You improve on those week by week, your team will start winning. Just excuse me for the digression, but if you quantify things, your team has to be able to juggle 500 times, and then next week 600, and then 800. You get to about 1,500. I think that's enough. Above that, probably the marginal utility. But the amount of learning you do, the amount of ball feeling and all that stuff you get through juggling is going to compensate for a lot of other things on the field that are not quantifiable. There's this concept of the Koopman operator in mechanical engineering, which is basically trying to say, look, I have this complex process. I'm producing a machine. I'm putting some inputs in, and then something comes out of there. It's pretty complex. There's lots of heat transfer and material science issues going on. But if I could reduce this transformation, this particular production process, let's call that a transformation. If I could reduce it to certain elements, or called linearly independent vectors, to use a little bit more math, and capture the essence of this transformation, then I can, and I know what those linearly independent vectors are. Well, then I can work with this, and it's not just some complex, what's the word? Part of the envelope type process. I forgot the word. Doesn't matter. It's not some random process that I hope or I believe I can do. I can quantify those linearly independent back of the envelope. That's the word. It's not just some back of the envelope process. I can understand what the factors are. I can influence them. I can quantify them, and I can produce better results, which is what it's all about. So scaling is about quantification. Scaling is about having a culture of quantification and accountability. The conversation in this episode is a little bit less about scale. Actually, I was digressing. It's an interesting question. Well, how do you scale? I've said this before. I think we need industrial management courses in business schools about scaling. And I think it's all about quantification of things, which if you really look at, let's say, the mechanical engineering departments of the UC system, which I've been doing recently for other reasons, I think it's very interesting, actually. Just look at what's going on in academia, right? Look at what's going on in academia. Try to understand what are scientists working on, let's say in mechanical engineering, because that's really what's going to happen in industry sooner or later. Look, that's where the knowledge is created. It's not going to come from somewhere else, right? If the mechanical engineering departments of the most important universities in your vicinity are working on X, well, then X is probably going to proliferate throughout industry, right? You can be pretty sure. It's not always the case. Particularly, actually, Tesla and Elon Musk were a good example of where where academia was doing one thing, let's say in aerospace. They weren't really thinking too much about reusable rockets because they gave up on it, or they didn't want to have this type of technology because it wasn't really good for making money and all that stuff, because of vested interest. And then this entrepreneur comes along, gives a presentation at the aerospace department of MIT, which should be the place where all these new things get developed. And he tells them, basically, you guys are working on the wrong things. I'm going to work on X and show you guys that it can be done. So this is just sort of a side note here. Again, back to the point. Now, what do we do with a company that figured out scaling and becomes very large? And this is now the conversation. Also, antitrust. University of Chicago, where I'm from, talks about this a lot. Zingales on his podcast talks about it a lot. He is definitely, even though he's actually not, I don't think he's a professor of any of that stuff, but he's very interested in those topics. Antitrust, freedom, authority. Those are important things, and this is how I'm tying this now back to even the Enlightenment conversation. Okay. Basically, here's the question. Okay, we are at the crossroads of a massive new compute paradigm revolution, if you want, with neural nets representing nature. We will get to massive increases in wealth, and we will have much larger companies, because scaling is going to be the key to wealth creation. How do we deal with that kind of scale? How do we deal if Tesla becomes a $5-10 trillion company? Well, how does a company like that function? Okay, this is not an economics question per se. This is really a political, a liberal, a legal question, right? And then I think parts of what can be done is what we already have, which is we can have shareholders, and we can have voting, we can have those sort of things. I think one of the things that Musk is intuitively doing is exposing himself to the public. Not because he wants to be the showman, I think because he wants the checks and balance. I really, truly believe that he's out there, that he has even bought Twitter, X, for that reason, to be out there and to be constantly checked by the public. It's important to have this self-discipline. If you know deep in your heart that you're going to become the largest company in the world, you want to have a checks and balance in place. And this is one of the ways to do it, to be out there in the public. So this is one way that you can do it sort of voluntarily. But of course, society cannot just rely on voluntary checks and balance implementation. And by the way, there's also a little bit of an oxymoron here. The oxymoron being, well, I mean, in order to be large, you have to have an autocratic, order flow in the company. I mean, you really have to be aggressive. In a sense that you have to, you can't all be democratic, right? You can't all be sort of, you can't constantly vote on should we now open a factory in Mexico or not, or India or not, right? There has to be an autocratic structure in the company. On the other hand, again, you don't want to have a fascist, $5 trillion company. You don't want that, and we can see that. Even with Apple, when you go to an Apple store, you're being treated pretty badly, if you ask me. Amazon, Google, they don't care about customers because they are monopolies. They're doing a lot for customers, of course, nothing wrong with them, but there's definitely this sense of Big Brother is doing whatever they want, and you don't have a lot of power, right? The one thing that the U.S. has is all this lawsuits that you can start with companies and that kind of thing. So that's one thing you can do. I don't know. I think for us shareholders, it is paramount to have the pulse, you have the thumb on the pulse of these companies, and to be conscious of the fact it is our goal. You see, that's the problem, that It is our goal. It is our destiny. Or if we succeed, success equals being very large. That's what's going to happen. And we have to anticipate that and find ways to communicate with the company and also with ourselves and be very clear about this as far as we're concerned, right? That we're going to be shareholders, owners of a company that will have enormous, enormous market power. That's what's going to happen with Tesla. That's what's happening with Tesla already. And that's what's going to happen also with, for example, with NVIDIA. It's happening already with NVIDIA and so on and so forth. Of course, one thing you can do as a society, what you can do is, you can enhance competition. You can invest in R&D on the university side. You can